Okay, so we had a loose wheel bearing here, and we could see it in the movement of the tire. And so we get the hub off and see that the outer lock nut is loose on the spindle. So we need to get this apart, adjust the bearing, tighten it back up. First thing on these older vehicles like this is a lot of time you'll see that there's a C-clip that's holding the axle out. Now, to get the C-clip off, you need a couple of punches of roughly the same length, and then you can start driving them off. Stop when it's part way off so that you can control it and pull it off. Otherwise, you're going to shoot that thing. It's going somewhere, and you're never going to find it. Now, we're going to take this bearing and this thrust washer off, and we're going to set them down. Now, one of the things that I'm doing is when I set these things down, I stack them in the order that they come off. That way I know how they go back on. So there's C-clip, thrust washer, bearing, just like that. All right, now I've got another thrust washer right here that stacks on top of the bearing. And then here's that outer lock washer. So we're going to get this nasty greasy thing off. This is very typical of any older Borg manual or semi-automatic locking hub assembly. Okay, now I've got this guy right here is a retaining plate. And the retaining plate has these holes in it, and the holes will actually line up with the pin on this inner washer. So I've got this inner lock nut, inner washer. I'm going to take it off. It's always exciting to watch somebody screw a big lock nut off. Let's get this off so we can really see that pin.
Yeah, Mr. Capero, I have to film my tank.
Okay, so there, right there is the pin, and these holes in this lock plate, one of them will align with that pin like that. So there's the pin going through that hole. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. So now I kind of clean this up. Here's the bearing, just in case you needed to know what that bearing looked like. That's the outer bearing, and it actually looks pretty good. Just a quick examination, doesn't look terrible. A lot of times we would clean it and really look at it. Now here's a common mistake. A lot of times people will put that washer so that that pin is pointing towards the bearing, and that just screws everything up. That pin needs to be pointing away from the bearing towards the outside of the car. So we're going to thread this bad boy on. Okay, that socket's not going to work for me. I don't have the right socket in here, so I'm going to have to improvise because I want to make sure that I preload the bearing properly. So I'm going to run it down by hand first, like that. Then I'm going to rotate, and I'm going to run it down by hand, rotate, run it down by hand. And you'll see as it's rotating that it loosens that bearing up enough that I can move that lock nut in just a little bit deeper. And now I'm going to go get a different tool. Okay, so normally I would have a socket that would have tabs on it that would go into those slots. I don't have that here. So I'm going to use a large pair of vise grips. I'm going to try and engage a couple of those slots, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate that bearing retainer, that lock nut, in like that until it stops. And I can feel the tightness in the rotor as I spin it. It's very snug. So now what I want to do is I want to loosen it slightly. And this is a weird thing. As you're loosening it, you'll feel that it goes loose and then stops. And it's that goes loose and stops part that you want to be at. If you go too far loose, then the problem is that the bearing's too loose. If you don't go far loose enough, the bearing's too tight. So that's what's known as bearing preload. We over tighten it to preload it, and then we back off to loosen it slightly so that the bearing is hopefully adjusted just as it needs to be. Clean my lock plate up. I'm going to put it on, and it doesn't sit down over the pin that direction. So now I'm going to try it this direction, and there, it sits over the pin. So that lock plate will keep this nut from loosening up anymore. Okay, you can take our outer bearing retainer, thread it on. Be careful not to cross thread these things. They're fine pitch. It's easy to do, but if you cross thread it, then you've got to replace the spindle, and that's kind of a pain in the tail. Same thing, I'm going to grab this pliers and I'm going to tighten that up. This one, I want to try to lock against that plate. So I want it pretty tight. And there's no backing that one off. We don't want that one coming loose. Spin that, still feels pretty good. So now I've got my inner seat for this Torrington bearing. Torrington bearing, here's my outer plate. Now that seat, bearing, and plate are all there so that I could preload the axle and keep the axle shaft pulled out. And here's the horseshoe clip. Now, this always gets exciting. I'm going to drive down on that horseshoe clip, control it while you do it so you don't end up sending it flying. Okay, so I've moved the axle, I've moved the plate, I've moved everything around. I'm going to rotate that until the hub goes back on. Hub goes on nice and easy. And that's all there is to adjusting that bearing, getting everything snugged up so that we can take all that play out of the tire and wheel.